I'm Mark Hennick. This is So-Called Normal. Hey folks, welcome to So-Called Normal. I'm Mark Hennick. Today on the show we have Anna Mehler Paperny. She's the author of the book, Hello, I Want to Die, Please Fix Me. I love the title of that. It grabbed me immediately, so I knew I had to have her on the show, and I know you're not going to be disappointed by the conversation as well. I do want to give you a heads up. I mean, as you might guess by the title of the book, we talk a lot about suicide. We spend a lot of time talking about illness, we talk a bit about her attempts and her hospitalizations, and we have so much in common. So you're going to hear me talk a lot more than I normally do on these things because I felt like I had so much in common with Anna. But go out and buy her book. I'll tell you that now. I'm going to tell you that after the interview as well. I think you're really going to be interested in this one. So here's my conversation with Anna Mehler Paperny.
I usually introduce myself as a reporter. I work for Reuters in Toronto. But now I can add book author, I guess.
Yes.
It still seems strange to include that as part of my biography. But
why? You've been writing for years.
I've been writing for all my professional life, yeah. But this is my first book. This is my first attempt at something of this scope. And it still feels foreign a little bit.
And you have quite an extensive list of references in the back. As I scan through the weight of the book, I had appendix envy, I think, something I've never experienced before. No, because it's so thoroughly researched, and you've talked to so many people. Your background as a reporter, I think, really came through.
It really helps me here. I felt like this is something that in order to do it justice, I really needed to dig in and I wanted to include my own story because I thought that was an important sort of framing mechanism.
Yeah.
But I wanted to be able to get beyond my own story and sort of research what we know and what we don't know and what the limitations are.
So I'm interested in that as a mechanism, first of all, or why that's the approach. But before we get there, can you tell me what is your story? What's the story that you set out to tell in this book?
So I set out to tell the story of suicide and depression, both my own story as somebody who first tried to kill herself almost a decade ago now, when I was 24 years old, and has since then, over the past almost 9 years, sort of kept trying to kill myself, but also spent most of the time trying to find something I could live with, trying to find sort of a sense of self and a way to be that was bearable. Yeah. And that was intensely difficult. So it's about sort of that journey, but it's also about my attempts to find out what this is. What is depression? What is suicidality? What do we know about it? What don't we know about it? And
which is a lot, it turns out.
There's a lot we don't know. Yeah. So it sort of chronicles that and sort of looks at specifically just where we fall down. And we fall down a lot when it comes to addressing the illness, caring for people who have the illness, getting what tools we know work into the hands and into the brains of people who need it. Yeah.
So you're 24 when this starts hitting you. Where are you in your life at that point? You're already an award-winning, successful reporter by that point?
I wouldn't call myself award-winning, but I was employed. Yeah. I was working for the Globe and Mail at the time, and I had just come off to really what I felt were really good assignments. And yet I was overcome by this feeling of despair and this sense of failure. And it sort of dogged me everywhere. Everything I did, everything I tried to do felt like a bust. Felt like I failed even before I started.
Like even though you were already successful in many respects career-wise, it wasn't enough? Is that it?
I felt like a fraud. Right. I felt like I was faking it.
Impostor syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Intense imposter syndrome. And that's something that really took over my life to the point where I felt I had no choice but to kill myself.
When did you start to actually realize that? Had this thought always kind of been there in the background, in the shadows, or did it really surprise you at some point? Oh, I want to kill myself. Like, did you see it coming?
No, I didn't see it coming. But this feeling had so taken over my brain that it didn't feel like a disorder to me. It felt like the truth.
Felt like it was normal.
Yeah, of course I want to kill myself because I just deserve to die.
Yeah, who doesn't, right? Yeah, I felt like when I was in that too, started to think of it as I developed this bad habit of thinking about suicide or trying to kill myself.
It becomes reflexive.
That's it. It became my coping mechanism for almost everything. I felt like it just became so easy. Well, I mean, I've come to terms with it, to peace with it, I think. But it was all, I can relate to what you're saying because it seemed very strange to me that other people didn't think this way, that they couldn't see what I saw.
It felt very strange to me when someone told me that I had an illness.
Right.
I thought, no, I don't. Illnesses are treatable.
Right.
And what I have isn't treatable. This is just the way I am.
Yeah.
This is just, I feel like I need to die because I do need to die.
So when did that happen? Is that when you first realized that somebody told you, hey, maybe this isn't the way you're supposed to be?
I was sitting in a psych ward having tried to kill myself.
And that's when you found out, sitting in the psych ward?
That's when I found out I had an illness. A psychiatrist told me, he was like, I think you have major depressive disorder. And at first I was like, no, I don't.
Yeah.
You're the crazy one
crazy.
here. Yeah. It just didn't seem, it wasn't conceivable to me that this could be a mood disorder, because that would mean that my convictions were wrong.
Right.
That there was something flawed about how I was feeling about myself.
Right.
And it took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that actually this was a mood disorder. It didn't have to be this way. This was something treatable. That was a revelation for me.
Yeah. Now, were you always chronically suicidal, or did it flare up at stressful times or in certain times of year, that kind of thing?
It became chronic. It wasn't constant, but it was episodic. So the depression, I think, was almost constant with significant variations.
Yeah.
And when it got bad, that's when the suicide and feelings of suicidality took over.
Sure.
But I mean, in my teenagehood, I think always I've had trouble with issues around like a sense of self and self-esteem. But I wouldn't call myself depressed as a child or as a teenager. This was something. This sense of hopelessness was something new that sprang up in young adulthood.
Not to get too psychoanalytic, I don't want to psychoanalyze you or anything, but not that I'm qualified to do that anyway. But what was home like? What was would somebody who knew 8-year-old Anna have thought, oh yeah, that tracks, that she was going to go that way?
I don't think so. My home life was really wonderful. I had, in fact, like after I was diagnosed with depression, one of the persistent emotions I felt was guilt, because nothing has ever happened to me that's bad enough to warrant this kind of feeling.
I have no reason to be depressed.
I have no exactly.
Yeah.
I have no excuse.
Which is obviously the different, or that's the whole point of having depression.
Right. You don't need a reason.
You don't need a reason.
Yeah. It just happens.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So this sidelines you. You find out, hey, maybe something's wrong or not quite right while you're in a psych ward in Toronto, in one of the Toronto psych wards. Okay. So I worked as a clinician. Long after I spent my own, went through the revolving door quite a few times.
Where did you work?
So in and around Toronto, and that was a really interesting experience for me. To many years later, after I achieved recovery, I don't even.
Congratulations.
Well, I'm not even comfortable saying that, because I still relapse, occasionally. And recovery is not a black and white thing. Remission, yeah, exactly. But then to go back into some of these psych wards in and around Toronto, and I grew up in a small town, and then to see how things really weren't all that different all these years later. The environment itself was still not always that conducive to recovery. So what was your experience like going into a psych ward for the first time, finding out that, oh, hey, I'm sick?
It's scary. The scariest place, I think, is the mental health emergency unit.
Right.
Because that's where people are in acute crisis, and a lot of the times, they're sort of waiting for urgently needed help.
Yeah.
So the priority is sort of containment and control to a degree. So being there when you don't have any experience with that sort of thing, even when you do have experience, I was there more recently, and even though I knew what I was getting into, I was there voluntarily. Right. I checked myself in, and even then, it's a scary place to be. Sure.
Sometimes, in some ways, it's even scarier then, I think, because I don't know. I guess I always felt it, because I've done it both ways. I've been involuntarily admitted and brought myself in. And it was almost, bringing myself in was almost scarier sometimes, because it's like you go in because you're so desperate for help, but then the help that you get isn't always, it's not going to do it for you, put it that way. It's not going to cure you.
Or it's hard because you go in part, fueled by this perhaps irrational hope.
Right.
You're like, someone is going to help me get me better. Whereas like if you're being involuntarily hospitalized, you're sort of like, okay, this isn't up to me.
Yeah.
This is outside my control. Someone else is taking over here.
Yeah,
Whereas going in of your own accord, it's like, okay, this is my decision. What am I doing?
Right. Yeah. So what brought you to that place, to bring yourself in, not knowing that you're sick, but having these suicidal thoughts? What made you make the decision to go into hospital, to bring yourself in?
I didn't decide to bring myself in until I knew that I had depression. I knew I was sick. And that was actually this year. It was several months after a suicide attempt. And I could tell that my mood was getting worse. And I was having trouble, pulling myself out of these, deep pits of despair.
Yeah.
And I was just like, and at the time, there was hope in an intervention. I was hoping that electroconvulsive therapy would be what it took to get me out.
Right. Why did you jump to that one?
It has one of the higher efficacy rates of interventions, and I hadn't tried it yet.
Okay.
So I was like, well, if I feel this bad and if I truly want to get well, I should try everything out there.
Right.
So I decided to try it. But at the time, in terms of what was available, I could only get it as an inpatient.
Okay.
So I had to check myself in.
Right.
So that decision was really tough because I knew what psych wards were like.
Yeah.
And they're not pleasant places.
Right.
I mean, they can, there are degrees of unpleasantness, and you can make them less unpleasant. You can make them better places to be, to exist and hopefully get better while you're in there.
Compliance helps with that, I find. If you're more compliant, it's more pleasant.
Yeah, it's true.
Then they're not as likely to strap you down. Not to make anybody afraid who's listening to this, but it's a reality of what the system is like. I think sometimes we see all these glossy pictures from the hospital foundations and all that stuff of smiling people recovering from their mental illness.
Yeah,
and it can still be scary inside.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I haven't been strapped down, but it's definitely not a smiley place.
Oh, you don't know what you're missing. No.
Really? I should go back.
Yeah, no. Well, I will say, however, as I've had both good and bad experiences in psych wards, and I don't necessarily regret. Even sometimes if the experience itself might have been traumatic, at least it kept me alive, right? So I'm still very much on that perspective that it's a part of the system that needs to exist for a very particular purpose.
It definitely needs to exist, but I think we need to be judicious about how we use it.
Yes, and I think we're in some ways becoming more liberal in how we use it. We're telling almost everybody, it seems, to go to hospital, that a medication will solve all your problems. Sometimes you hear that, and it's just not the case. For me, it happened to work reasonably well for me. Once I found, once you figure it out a little bit of the types of medications and therapies that work for you. But that's not the case for everybody. Actually, for some people, it makes them a lot worse.
One of the things I found in researching my book is that doctors in Ontario and elsewhere in Canada are much more readily putting people on forms.
Yes.
They're much more readily involuntarily hospitalizing people.
Yeah, and seclusion and restraint is actually quite
is
highly
going
used.
up as well.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, you can argue that they have good reason to do so, and certainly, when what you're doing is trying to prevent someone from killing themselves or from harming themselves,
right.
The stakes are high. But I think we need to look really closely at whether there are alternatives that we're not using.
Yeah, and the World Health Organization and many others say that there are. You can usually diffuse those situations well before they get to that point. Suicide prevention isn't done by lining up ambulances at the bottom of the bridge, right? Well, there's all kinds of other ways.
It's not?
Yeah, really. But this is the approach that we take, right?
Yeah.
And yes, there are stages or there's levels of care that people need. But we prevent suicide by preventing all kinds of things well before that. I mean, that's the view that I take.
Yeah.
But you've talked to, how many people did you talk to in writing this book?
Oh my God. More than 100 for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people. And they were so generous with their time. Like,
right.
I was very lucky to have people willing to talk to me I could call back and be like, what about this thing?
Yeah. So did you find disparities, even among especially among experts, in terms of what they were telling you?
To a degree.
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely depends on what they were an expert in, but there were definitely I mean, in things as basic as like, well, what do we know for sure about depression?
Right.
That's something that, no one can agree on.
Right.
Or let alone things like, when should we hospitalize somebody?
Right.
Are the police the right people to call when you're in crisis?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, often, in Canada and Toronto, they're the only people available.
Right.
But there are crisis lines for a reason.
Sure.
And, there are like mental health crisis teams in police forces for a reason.
Yeah.
But no, there was a lot of disparity in terms of what people were telling me, what I was finding.
Yeah. And it seems, I think in many ways we've kind of moved on from the chemical imbalance idea of mental illness more toward now a neuroplasticity, genetics, kind of epigenetics approach, in that, it might be part of your brain, but a lot of it depends on your surroundings as well.
Yeah. I was hearing a lot about neuroplasticity and epigenetics, and like this is how your brain responding to its environment. Yeah. So like these are the steps we can take to address that. Right.
So in your case, then, I mean, it sounds like as a way to try to understand yourself, you're using these skills that you had developed as a reporter and as a journalist. My reaction to that was that a way to distance yourself from your own story, or was it a way to try to intellectualize and understand it?
I mean, both, right? Yeah. I wasn't used to writing about myself. This was something very new, but I was used to doing journalism. Right. So this was a way for me to approach this in a manner in which I was familiar. And it was a way for me to dig into it using, methods that I knew how to use.
Yeah.
So it kind of gave me a degree of distance,
right,
and a degree of perspective as well.
Yeah. I've found that from a lot of people that I talk to, being able to separate yourself out from your own narrative, your own story a little bit, even if it only is snapping into a different mindset, reporter mindset now, instead of Suffering Anna mindset, right?
Yeah, Suffering Anna mindset is the worst mindset.
Tell me about it. Or Suffering Mark mindset, I say.
Yeah.
But that shift, and I do this all the time if I'm, doing this podcast or doing something on stage or whatever else it is, that if you can snap into a different way of being for a few minutes, it's a nice vacation, first of all, but it actually does. You carry forward some of that information over to your other life as well, I think.
Absolutely. One of the most valuable gifts I've gotten from my family is a very dark sense of humor.
Yeah.
The ability to sort of look at things from a funny perspective and being able to joke about things, even when you're in the ICU recovering from a suicide attempt, is a really powerful thing. And in that same vein, I know things are bad in my brain when I can't do that. Yeah. When I'm so unwell that I can't find something funny about the situation I'm in.
When the humor
I know
goes.
Things are pretty dire.
I've had one comedian so far on this show, but I mean it's fairly common knowledge. I think that comedians are often people who suffer personally themselves, and that they're drawing on that as a source of humor. I guess it's similar to a journalist, digging into the research and the interviews about it, using humor to try to understand a situation makes it more palatable, I think.
Exactly. It creates that same sort of distance, I think, that you almost need as a coping mechanism to survive something. It's
exhausting being in the dungeon all the time,
kidding.
Right? Yeah. So you go in for this hospitalization. How many rounds of ECT did you end up doing when
12.
you went? 12. And did you notice or how close together were they?
I was getting them 2 or 3 times a week.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And was it everything that you imagined it would be? Tell me about that experience.
No, I don't want to dissuade people from trying it because the success rates are high and it's evidence. It's backed by evidence, but in my case, it did not lift my mood really.
Right.
And it messed up my memory a lot. I mean, which is advertised, like people are told going in when you consent to it. It says I'm consenting to this, knowing that there will probably be memory loss involved.
Right. And actually, I remember reading something at some point that might be part of the mechanism of action, is that if you can't remember part of the reasons why you're
so
depressed.
Sad.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so interesting. No, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
In my case, most of what I forgot a lot sort of in the immediate term and then regained it. But things that sort of immediately surrounding the seizures themselves Which, I mean, I was living in a psych ward, so it wasn't the best time in the world.
Sure.
It wasn't like something you want to remember. But I forgot those, which kind of freaked me out later on.
Right. Now, writing the book, were you able to access some of those memories that had been
Oh, this
locked
was
away?
after.
Oh, after. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it was
yeah.
after you wrote the book that you
Yeah.
did these. Oh, interesting.
I know. I was hoping that I would write the book and then just feel better, and then I could write. Like, isn't that how it works?
So it's funny you mention this because I keep inserting myself into your story, and I almost never do that with any other guest, but I really relate to everything you're saying. And I found that writing the book, like, I had accessed memories that I had long since repressed for good reason.
Yeah.
It turned out.
Oh, God.
And it was a struggle, and it's still a struggle to go back, and I've done it. I've done 6 drafts so far, but I find yours, what I've read of it so far, soothing in many ways.
Oh, good.
Yeah, because I think one of my preferred defense mechanisms is intellectualization.
Yeah.
If I can think something through, maybe I can figure it out. And I get a lot of that from yours.
Yeah, that was definitely something I tried to do, was sort of like sort things out for myself. And
Yeah.
I mean, I guess to a degree that's what cognitive behavioral therapy is,
Yeah.
like you kind of logic your way out of these toxic thoughts.
Right. Yeah, insofar as you're able to.
Yes.
I think what I work on now is sitting with uncomfortable feelings and letting them be uncomfortable. That
Yeah?
it's okay that sucks. Let
How's
it suck.
that going?
Not very well. No. No, it's terrible, but it's supposed to be terrible. That's the thing. It's like, yeah, there are difficult emotions. And,
Yeah.
we hear a lot about this now because I think mental health and wellness is a very popular discussion right now, right?
I think it's popular on a surface level. I think we
Absolutely.
rarely delve much deeper than that.
Almost never. That I think it's very often about yoga and coloring and, which is great. All those things are nice, but are people really getting into, the title of your book, I Want to Die, Please Fix Me? That's still jarring for people.
Yeah.
It still makes people uncomfortable to talk about the difficult stuff.
Yes, and that's why I wanted to be so blunt, because it is difficult. And in a way it should be, but it shouldn't be uncommon. It should be
Right.
something that we readily talk about.
Yeah. Now, when you were writing the book and now, now that it's out and talking about it, have you encountered, we need to talk about suicide in particular, but we hear all the time, especially in journalism, that there's a right way and a wrong way. There's a productive and not so productive way of talking about it. Did you have to grapple with this both in writing the book and now in promoting it as well?
Yes, probably more in promoting it just
Yeah.
because of the kinds of discussions that I've been having. But I mean, there's definitely, I think unequivocally, there are irresponsible ways to approach suicide, and that's horrible and shouldn't be done. But I think we can still be a lot more blunt and a lot more frank than we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, helicopters circling Robin Williams' house the morning after that he's found dead, right? This not so productive of one of the news agencies who did that to do that. However, I think sometimes we get so hypersensitive of triggers and trigger warnings and that idea that we can't feel uncomfortable emotions. Well, no, actually we need to. And speaking anecdotally, that's what got me to the edge, was not wanting to deal with my uncomfortable emotions, right? Using it as an escape in some ways. So I think you're right that we need to have more of this out there, assuming that people know what they're getting themselves into, right?
Yeah. And again, there are ways to approach it responsibly. We can talk about it like something that's treatable.
Yes.
And as something that, there is help for. Of course, the coda to that is that you need to make the help available.
Right.
It's no good to talk about suicide and say, like, it's okay, you can get help.
Yeah.
And then when
drop
someone
the mic
goes for
and
help,
walk away.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think that people need to understand as an extension of that help works. That if it's hard as hell to find the right help and to get connected in a way that is meaningful for you, but it can actually work for most people.
Yes. Yeah, prevention works.
Prevention absolutely works. Now, this gets political too, because I have a friend we did an episode with him a few weeks ago who believes in the right to kill yourself, that should be something that people are allowed to do. Where do you stand on that?
I mean, I think it's interesting that right now in Canada and in some U.S. states, certain kinds of suffering give you the right to die, the right to a doctor-assisted death.
Right.
But if your suffering is in your brain, if you have mental illness, then your suffering is not seen as being serious enough to warrant your assisted death. Mm-hmm. I think that's notable.
Yeah.
And I think eventually the Canadian Supreme Court, I suspect there's going to be a case brought before the court of somebody with mental illness whose
Sure.
mental illness precludes them from getting assisted death. And they're going to contest that in court, and the Supreme Court will have to decide.
And I believe they already are, actually. I think at least one of those cases have already been brought forward. I think my major hesitation with it, of course, is that if the thing that you're using to make decisions is the thing that might be impacted by the illness, right? Your mind, your cognitive, or your decision-making ability, rather, it always introduces the possibility that maybe this isn't what you really want.
Right. And somebody, and I mean, it's a tricky distinction to draw, but somebody made the point to me that if the mental illness is compromising your cognitive ability and your ability to make this decision, that's when the decision becomes something that a doctor can't adhere to.
Right.
But if you have this illness and it's causing you suffering and you're making the rational decision, aside from the suffering, you say, like, I recognize that I have this illness. I recognize that, well, it may be treatable. It's not treatable for me. It can't be alleviated in my case. And knowing what is causing me, I want to die.
Right.
The tricky part is a doctor would have to assess that and kind of tease that out. And that would be very difficult. But I think it's possible.
Yeah. Now, when you were suicidal, again, anecdotally, but did you believe that it was possible to get better when you were killing yourself or trying to kill yourself?
When I've been closest to suicide, I did not believe it was possible for me to get better.
Right.
When I'm farther away from it, I need to believe that recovery and remission is possible. Because if I don't, I can't keep going.
Right.
So it's difficult in my case because I don't think realistically that I would be a candidate for assisted death. But that's because in order to wake up this morning, I had to tell myself, I can do better. I can get better. And in order to believe that, I think I need to believe that I'm not a candidate for assisted death.
Right. So then do you think it opens up a highway of sorts for people to not have, because I think that's brave. I think it's courageous. It's hard as hell some days, but it's a practice, right? Recovery is a practice. It doesn't just happen overnight. It's something that you learn how to do, I think. But if that highway existed, even if I was going through, as I not often, but sometimes do, 2-3 weeks or months of a really dark period, if I could fast track my way through to skip getting to the other side of the tunnel, then I would miss the opportunity to actually get better, right?
I don't think, and I mean, again, this is for crafters of the law who are much smarter than me, but I don't think even in like the most liberalized circumstances, you're going to get doctors who are just like, check.
Yeah,
check,
true.
I think it's always going to be a really difficult and tricky decision to make.
Yeah.
And I think you need very experienced practitioners who are confident in their ability to finesse these distinctions, but who also know the patient well enough to know, like, is this something Mark's come out of before? Yeah,
and I guess I've got so many. I'm such a skeptic about so many areas of it, I guess, is that I've seen so many issues within the medical system, within the healthcare system. Often most of the stigma that I've experienced has been from healthcare providers who I felt like didn't really get to know me in a meaningful way. And I hear that all the time from people who have struggled and suffered. There's also for me, the human rights issue, I think, that in order for somebody to get to that point where they've been struggling that severely for so long, they might have been bounced around in a system that isn't helping them. Or they might have never known for 20 years that they are able to access help and able to get to that kind of help. So I think there's also so many, thinking of the assisted dying piece or not, there's so many problems with the system that people don't have the same kind of access to healthcare and recovery on the front end of it, that by the time they get to that point, it might seem hopeless and that they'll never recover, but that's because they've been screwed for so long by a system that's made it harder for them to recover.
And that's been an argument against assisted death all the way through. People have argued that in the cases of other illnesses as well, that you don't want death to be the easier option than caring for somebody.
Right.
So I think for sure, before we provide death, we need to get much better at providing care.
To fix the system, yeah. So when you did the... let's go back to when you're to the time period of the book. So you're navigating the mental health system then? Or when the first hospitalization was at 24, or was that when you
Yeah, the
first
first
realized?
hospitalization was at 24.
How many more came after that?
As an inpatient, there was one in 2015, so about 4 years later.
Yeah.
And then there was one. Well, there were a couple actually this year.
Okay.
And then there were a couple occasions when I went in as an outpatient to get checked out. I swallowed a pain thinner, and my doctor was like, "You should call poison control."
Yeah.
And poison control was like, "Your lungs might have pneumonia." Yeah, but those were one-offs. Those were not inpatient occasions.
Yeah. So that's a fairly long spacing, 4 years between going in when you're 24 and then several years, 4 years later. Mm-hmm. Did you find at that point, did you figure it out, or did it just, you went back to your version of coping, whatever that was? Did you get help that?
I was getting help. One thing that I was incredibly lucky about is that in my first inpatient stay when I was 24, I got hooked up with a psychiatrist who followed me after I was discharged, and that was so lucky. I think that saved my life, honestly, because this was somebody who followed me for years afterwards.
Nice, wow.
And having that care, having that person I could trust and could talk to, like no matter how bad things got, it didn't prevent things from getting bad.
No, sure.
But I think it helped ensure that I stayed alive.
I think that's an important distinction, that it doesn't prevent things from getting bad. That recovery doesn't mean that you're never going to have any bad days or bad weeks or bad months. But I think it helps to give you better skills to deal with them, right? Yeah,
it gives you a lifeline. I mean, I wouldn't even consider myself recovered at that point. Like, those were tough years.
Right.
The past several years have been tough.
Yeah.
But having a care practitioner to hang on to and to talk to was so vital.
Yeah, and knowing that you could, I have this appointment next week. Maybe this problem could wait until then, right?
Exactly. This is somebody who will tell me that there's hope.
Yeah. Now, did you have, a lot of people can't access that kind of resource, and you mentioned that you were lucky to do so, either because they don't have benefits or they get put on a 18-month waiting list, right?
It's astonishing. I had an appointment earlier this month at a Toronto area hospital that had a year-long wait list for people referred there by their GPs. Yeah. If this were any other condition, people would be outraged.
It's criminal. It's criminal to be, and especially when it's one of the many kinds of conditions, but especially with mental illnesses, and especially if you're actively suicidal, it's only going to get worse unless you get the help you need. Like, it's not the type of thing that tends to fix itself.
Exactly.
So in writing the book, you must have come across this over and over again, the inconsistencies in the system, the problems that people are encountering. Yeah,
and it's so frustrating, especially like in Canada, we like to think of ourselves as a country with universal health care. We pride ourselves on it. But the reality is, if you don't have benefits, you don't get pharmacotherapy, and you don't get psychological help. So really, the primary ways that we treat mental illness aren't available to you unless you're privileged.
Right.
And that's astonishing.
And we wonder why there's a year-long, and that's average, a year-long wait list to see a psychiatrist, when we've got all these other healthcare providers waiting on the sidelines that people can't access because they can't afford them, or they don't know about them, or they don't realize the evidence. Psychotherapy is just as effective as medication. And ideally, you do both together.
Exactly.
Right? So was your method of treatment primarily with the psychiatrist and with medication ECT?
It was both.
Okay.
It was mostly pharmacotherapy, but also psychotherapy, also CBT.
Okay.
So I was getting evidence-based care. Yeah. It was just tough to find a treatment mechanism that was working for me.
Right. It's like throwing darts at a dartboard, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, there's interesting research just starting to come out. I mean, now that we've been paying so much attention to mental health, I think the research world it's always 10 years behind at least, but we're starting to find ways to, identify the right medication, or potentially the right medication for somebody before you even prescribe them. Because the old way, the way that I went through, is that you just prescribe a bunch of stuff and see what sticks.
Yeah, right? Just trial and error,
exactly.
and error.
So did you find the right medication fairly quickly, or did it take a while?
No, we haven't yet.
Oh, you still haven't? Okay.
Yeah. It's been, maybe 16, 17 different drugs in a bunch of different combinations.
Yeah. What's your primary concern, or what's the primary issue that causes you the most difficulty?
A lack of hope, I think. And again, this feeling of failure keeps coming up. This sense that my life is not worth living. Right. And that I've failed, and that I will continue to fail, and that there's no point in trying anymore. So like these really, and it keeps recurring, and I sort of, even when I notice like, oh, I've had this thought before,
Right.
it still doesn't take away from its potency.
Yeah. Do you seek out evidence to the contrary in the way that you would as a journalist, find the other sides of the argument?
I try, but probably not as hard as I should, and not as effectively as I could.
It's one of the things I noticed, and I still do it all the time. Actually, I do it more than I don't. When people compliment me for something or tell me that the work is meaningful, for example, and your book, I am confident, is going to help a lot of people, you don't hear it.
Or you minimize it.
Or you minimize it. Or
I was actually talking recently to my psychiatrist that I have a habit to both, on the one hand, need external validation because I can't, of my own accord, make myself feel good.
Right.
But on the other hand, I have a tendency to either minimize or discount my external feedback.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I need people to tell me, or I need something outside of myself to tell me I'm okay, I'm not horrible.
Right.
On the other hand, if people tell me I'm not horrible, I'll say, well, they must be wrong.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's creepy that I do the exact same thing. It's like you crave it, you need it, but then when you get it, it's
you
like,
reject it.
Don't worry about it. And then,
It's so self-destructive.
Have you explored some of the trendier therapies and interventions that are coming out now around gratitude and mindfulness and that kind of practice?
My psychiatrist did get me to try mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
I did they had a couple I can't remember how many weeks it was. They had a workshop. It's a little bit hokey, but it is effective.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah, like there is evidence for it. If you're able to sort of identify thoughts that you're having. Yeah. Tell yourself like, okay, this is a thought. Right. It's not necessarily true, but we're going to look at it and kind of it's sort of similar to CBT in that you're identifying thoughts and thinking about them as thoughts without sort of giving them power over you. Yeah. So that in that sense, it was helpful.
I find, that's almost what's worse, I think, is not necessarily the negative thought or the troubling thought. Everybody has weird, dark thoughts. I think everybody does anyway. And if they say they don't, they're a liar. But it's the inability to let it go and to let it float away, right? You get wrapped up in the thought and you cling to that thought for whatever reason, or you fight the thought, and that just makes it more powerful. Right?
Yeah, so that mindfulness was good in that sense. It was good at saying like, oh, there's a thought, beat, okay, moving on.
There's something called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy that kind of melds the two together.
Yeah.
I haven't done it yet myself, but I keep telling myself that I will at some point.
It's worth trying.
Have you done?
Yeah, a little bit.
It? Yeah. Okay. So, and it sounds very much like that's the idea that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I said this about this idea that I've already wanted to die for like half my life, so I might as well. No, I mean that's not a sob story. I don't mind. Okay. I'm good with it. No, I shouldn't. I guess that's my coping mechanism, right?
Yeah.
Is that's how I minimize it. But this idea that it's not a. I guess it's not a big deal to go out and try all these different things, however weird they might seem, however, hokey or strange, because, there's always death. So I might as well go try all these other things instead.
Yeah.
Right?
I need to be able to tell myself that I'm trying and that I'm trying everything I can. Because otherwise, what am I doing?
Well, exactly. What alternative is there except to try as much as we possibly can? And I think at some point I've kind of learned to enjoy the adventure of it, I guess. The anticipation of, will this work or will this totally mess me up? Because I should also note, I've also found lots of things that don't work.
Yeah.
But that's valuable information too, I think.
Better to know than not to.
Talk to me about so the book is just out. Who were you most afraid of reading this book?
Probably people I had interviewed. I was afraid of them reading it and being like, "Well, that's a mischaracterization of what I said." Which
that's what you do for a living, though.
I know, and I'm never going to stop being afraid of that as a reporter. You're always afraid, I think, of the people you talk to because they're the people like you spend your time, coaxing them out. Right. They spend time talking to you. You're so afraid of the thing that they put together. Or I was afraid of people who like have had similar experiences reading it and saying, well, that's not true to my life. That's not how I experienced it.
But it's not a memoir of their life.
No, exactly. So I had these really irrational fears that I was able to sort of I was kind of able to coax myself out of.
Yeah.
But they still pop up.
Well, so I want to name that it sounds like you did so much good work in this story and the interviews that this is going to help a lot of people I've mentioned.
I hope so.
Well, it will. I know that. Like I've been doing the mental health advocacy for a while now, and I think this is exactly the type of information that's needed. There's so much in this mental health fad in some ways that we're in, that everybody wants to talk about mental health now, and that never used to be that way. And I remember a time when it wasn't, and I'm not that old, but it's been kind of a scattershot. So there's a bunch of information out there in the ether about all kinds of different mental health related topics. But what I like about what you've done, or at least as far into it as I've gotten, is to try to bring that together in a coherent way that helps people to understand. So don't dismiss it, but thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
You know? Now, my worry is partly for you, that it sounds like that you're going through a difficult time presently, that, you've done such a momentously good thing, and I don't think you fully yet appreciate how significant it really is. So I want you to know how significant it is.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.
I hope so.
I'm trying to. It's hard because I don't want to overstate the potential of this book, but I really would like to believe that it can make a difference and that it can help people find a sense of self and find a sense of hope that they weren't able to before. In terms of the personal stuff, I mean, I keep thinking I'm over it. I keep thinking like, you know what? Oh, okay, I talk about this now as part of like this book that I've written. I'm done with it messing with my life, and then all of a sudden I wake up one day and I'm like, it's like a truck has hit me.
Yeah.
In order to keep going, I need to believe that I can minimize that, that I can make that, if not disappear, at least lose some of its power.
Yeah.
I don't know yet how I'll do that.
I don't either. But I think not every day is, I want to kill myself terrible. Right.
Oh, good.
And I think that getting comfortable with the fact that not every day is going to be great, and some days are still going to be, you got to drag yourself out of bed. That's okay, but because there's other days that are going to be really beautiful and really great. Those are the days that I live for. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is coming to peace. I've heard this from others too, coming to peace in myself, that's just kind of how my mind works. And it's also the birthplace of a lot of really incredible creativity and drive, and being able to share stories like you have, and to bring people together like you have. You wouldn't have done this, I don't think, had you not had your personal experience, right?
I probably wouldn't have.
Yeah. Did anything change for you in writing the book, either in terms of your understanding of yourself or mental health and mental illness in general?
A little bit of both. I understood better how this illness treated me and how that differs from how it treats other people, just how different people experience the disease, but also, again, how the very ways that we define and identify depression is so subjective and so specific to, who's writing the definitions. So that sort of changed the way I viewed it and changed the way I perceived our definitions around mental illness. But it also changed the way I saw mental suffering in general, because I saw sort of how society has minimized its impact on sufferers while maximizing its fear of people suffering from it and sort of the consequences of that.
Yeah, I've seen it, when you talk about, or in popular narratives now talk about the severity of mental illness, and it can be extremely severe and extremely debilitating. But it's often not, actually. For the majority of people, it's not the farthest end of the spectrum. But when we focus a lot on that's scary. And I think in some ways it embeds stigma further.
I think it should be possible for us to look at the severity of mental illness without stigmatizing or isolating the people suffering from that. People in that situation need care. They don't need further stigmatization.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I also think it's possible for depression to be or for any mental illness to be debilitating without its sufferers being a danger to other people.
Right.
And I think that's one of our big mistakes.
Well, and sometimes it's so silently debilitating that you could be functionally disabled by your mental illness and nobody would ever notice. Right? Because we become such good actors, I guess, at hiding our illness.
Yeah. And that should be what scares us.
Yeah.
That there are people among us whose suffering we're not aware of and who are leaving to suffer in silence on their own.
As you were working, did this cause? Did people in your workplace notice when you were not having good days, weeks, months, whatever it was?
Not in my workplace, no.
Yeah.
I had close friends who knew, but even they, there were very few people I confided in when I was feeling bad.
Yeah.
And there are more of them now. There are more people now who will ask me how I'm doing, and they mean it. They genuinely want to know. But so often I assume that people really didn't want to know.
Right.
The people that I shouldn't mention it because it would scare people away.
Yeah. The hey, how are you? And then by the time you answer, they're already halfway down the hall.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Or you just say fine.
Yeah.
You know? So, I mean, I still don't know how many people. I could probably count on, I guess, maybe 1.5 hands the number of people I would honestly tell when I was having a bad day.
Right.
Which is better than it used to be.
Sure. And why do you think that is? Is there still that fear?
I think so. There's also the fear of you don't want to hurt people. You know, you're worried that by telling someone how awful you're doing, you'll somehow burden them.
Right.
And there's this fear of being a burden.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if you already feel like a burden anyway.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's very real, and that's something I wrestle with.
Yeah. In your among your family, and you mentioned you have a few close friends, did you find support, or did people say the right things, I guess?
Yeah. They've been, my family's been incredibly supportive, and they've been put through the ringer on this. You know, obviously no one should have to go through this, but I feel really bad and again, every clinician will tell you that you shouldn't feel guilty about the self-harm that you do and its effects on other people, because you're not doing it to hurt people. It's not, but it's hard not to feel guilty about what I've caused my family to feel.
Have they given you evidence to the contrary that, no, we love you?
Yes, they've been so loving, and they've been so supportive unconditionally.
Yeah.
And they've been there in hospital with me. They've been with me when I've been having bad days outside of hospital.
Yeah.
I have friends who've just come to sit with me and just sort of be, or who will just talk to me when I need someone to talk to.
Yeah.
And that too has been so important in keeping me going.
Yeah. That's incredible. So what have they done, or what are some of the things that they've said that have been particularly helpful for you? And is there anything that you've experienced that maybe wasn't so helpful in terms of how people talk to you?
I remember one friend saying he was happy I was alive. And that sounds like the simplest thing in the world, but it means so much, because especially when you're feeling unsure how you feel about being alive, and this is someone who's telling you, I love you and I'm glad you're alive. That was so valuable.
That actually just made me a little bit emotional too.
Oh, sorry.
Because no, don't apologize. Stop. There's nothing to apologize for, because I think that's actually really beautiful. Somebody validating your life.
It really was. It was wonderful. In terms of less helpful, I remember I was on the phone to my grandfather after my first attempt. He was in Calgary, and he said, "No more stupid tricks." And I was like, okay.
As though you're a magician? A bad magician at that? What does that even mean?
I'm a terrible magician. Worst magician ever. So that just kind of, it sort of treats the suicide attempt as some tomfoolery.
Right.
I also had someone, and I think someone made me promise not to try again, which when I promised was a lie, but also made me feel terrible, because it made me feel like I had to lie to somebody that I loved,
right,
in order to communicate my love.
Yeah.
So that felt really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it sort of ties back to one of the things that clinicians I spoke with for the book kept telling me, which is that telling people not to kill themselves isn't always the most constructive thing to do.
Right. Well, because they're not going to say, "Oh, okay."
Oh, yeah, that's all I needed.
Yeah.
Right?
I wish you had told me that 3 days ago, right? No.
Exactly. So telling someone that you're glad they're alive, or that you love them, I think is or that the world is better with them in it, I think are all really powerful ways of dissuading. But actually telling someone, don't do that, when they really want this, and even as pathological as that desire is, can be really counterproductive.
Well, I think it's helpful to understand the reasons, or better understand the reasons why somebody wants to die in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, are they trying to escape and suffer really inescapable pain?
Yeah.
Or are they tired? You know, there's all kinds of reasons why people get to that place, and just ignoring them doesn't make those reasons go away.
Exactly. And yet for so long, that's how we treated suicide prevention. Was sort of trying to ignore, trying to bury the reasons driving the suicidality.
Yeah. So what's next for you? What are you looking forward to? I mean, this book is probably going to keep you busy, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
So what's next?
So I'm going back to my work at Reuters, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
It's a great newsroom, really wonderful people. And then I'll be a news reporter. And I'm hoping to write another book. I can't say what about yet. But
Because you don't know, or you're not allowed?
Mostly because I don't know.
Yeah.
I have no idea what I'm doing.
You'll figure it out, I'm
hopefully
sure.
I will figure out what I'm doing, and then it will be great.
Yeah.
So yeah, the future is kind of unwritten so far.
As it often is, I think, and as it should be. That's the exciting part of it.
Yeah.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for coming in and talking to me. I'm so glad that you wrote this book. I'm so glad that you're going to receive, and already have received, incredible praise for it. And I'm so glad that you're alive.
Thank you so much. That's all really wonderful to hear.
Thank you. All right, that's it. That was my conversation with author, Reuters reporter Anna Mehler Paperny. Her memoir, Hello, I Want to Die, Please Fix Me, available through Penguin everywhere now. Go out and buy it, please. It's quite a read. You heard me mention a number of times about the number of people that she talked to try to understand her story, the list of references in the back. It's obvious a really tenacious, successful journalist has written this book, and the way that she brings information together. So go pick up that book. You won't regret it. Follow Anna as well on Twitter, Facebook, wherever else you can find her, and look forward to her next book, whatever she decides that's going to be. I know I'm going to buy it as well. I want to thank you for listening. I want to ask you to go over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast and subscribe to So-Called Normal. Give us your subscription. Give us a rating at the bottom there. Those little stars mean a lot. Write a review if you like this interview. Share it with your friends. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere else, at Mark Hennick. That's at MarkHenick. Follow me everywhere for more information, or you can go to markhennick.com as well for more information about the podcast and about my work. What else do we need to do here? I want to thank all the people involved in this show, of course. Our wonderful editor, Dave Trafford, the people here at E1, Adrian, Kimberly, for making this show possible. It's really, these are the kinds of conversations like I had with Anna today that really make it all worthwhile. So tune in next week. We're here every Monday, and we got lots more great guests coming for you. Okay, that's it. I'm Mark Hennick. Take care. Bye-bye.